So in this video, I actually want to talk about the PlayStation Vita. It's official. It looks like the PlayStation Vita from Sony is officially dead. It said they're going to stop producing units of the PlayStation Vita, so no longer will it be on store shelves. Also, they did state that developers of PlayStation Vita games will no longer to be buy cartridges from Sony. So if you want to make a game physical for the PS Vita, it looks like that's no longer going to be possible. Sure, there are still games coming out for the PS Vita if you look at the store, but most of the games that are coming out for the PlayStation Vita this year are going to be small indie titles, and that's been the case for a couple of years now. Most of the games coming out for the PlayStation Vita have been small indie titles, so it's pretty much official that the PlayStation Vita is pretty much dead at this point. Sure, you can still buy games for it. You can still buy games on the PlayStation Store and things like that. When it comes to the actual physical hardware, when it comes to the physical cartridges, it's pretty much dead in the water. Sony pretty much killed off the PlayStation Vita, and I actually want to talk about my memories with the PlayStation Vita and the PlayStation Portable brand as a whole. Now, when it comes to the PlayStation family line of portable handhelds, I did actually own the PSP on day one. I actually bought it right around release, and I was so excited for the PlayStation Portable because I remember when the PlayStation Portable was coming out on the market. I remember it being revolutionary, not just in terms of graphics like PS2 graphics in your pocket for the PlayStation Portable or the PSP. I remember it being so revolutionary because I was blown away by the fact that that thing was going to be a full-on multimedia device in your pocket, and we never seen things like that from Nintendo. Nintendo is always known to just make handhelds strictly for gaming, so this was the first time I was actually quite excited for a handheld because it'd be cool to take like my movies, my pictures, my music, and everything on the go. And even the PSP had a web browser on it, which you guys know the DS back at the time didn't have a web browser. Then you guys know they did add a cartridge that actually allowed you to get a web browser on the original DS. I actually own that cartridge, but it was an add-on for the DS, and then it took a couple of iterations until they finally implemented an built-in web browser to the system, talking about the Nintendo DSi. That was the first console from Nintendo to really fully implement a lot of these features that the PSP have, like we're talking about these multimedia features, internet browser, and things like that. So going back to the PSP was really revolutionary for the time. I love the fact that the PSP was one console that had pretty much PS2 graphics in your pocket. The lineup of games on the PSP was very strong. Overall, the PSP was fantastic, and they were getting a lot of good AAA games on the PSP, especially third-party games on the PSP. That's primarily why I love the PSP so much. I love the fact you can take these games like NBA, Madden, Sims, things like that on the go with you, whereas the DS, not so much. Sure, they had some Maddens, they had some NBAs, whatever, they had some Sims, but the quality wasn't the same. It didn't really feel like you were taking a console experience on the go. We all know why the PSP sold so well. The PSP really sold so well because after the homebrew scene or the hacking scene came on the scene for the PSP, so many units were being sold on the PSP. And fun fact, the PSP is actually the third best-selling handheld of all time, so it's not like it did poorly. It actually did extremely well for a handheld, considering it was the third best-selling handheld of all time. But we all know why. Again, going back to the homebrew, the hacking scene, a lot of people were doing that just to illegally download PSP games to the system and not have to buy the games. That's primarily why that system sold so well. But you do have to give Sony some credit back in the PSP days, because the PSP was actually one system that Sony actually supported for quite some time. Even though the homebrew and the hacking scene was coming on and people were illegally downloading their games, they weren't paying for their games, Sony said, well, it's okay that people aren't actually buying our software. Let's keep supporting this system. And they supported this system very well. And then after pretty much you can kind of say the success of the PSP, they said, well, there was enough units already sold of the PSP. Let's move on to the PS Vita and let's see what the PS Vita has in store. And then the PS Vita came onto the market as a handheld. And the PS Vita did some revolutionary things for gaming. Like, for instance, I think it was the first handheld console to actually have dual analog sticks. I don't think anything at the time had dual analog sticks. You look at the 3DS. The 3DS did get dual analog analog support, but that came about in 2015, so that came many years after the original PS Vita launch. So that was pretty cool to get dual analog sticks on games. It meant games could have more functionality. That also meant shooters could be on the platform, because without dedicated analog sticks on your platform, you really can't have a good way to have shooters on your platform. Going back to the PSP did have an analog stick, and that was also revolutionary for the time, because Nintendo did not implement any type of 3D controls on their handheld, so that was cool, but it wasn't dual analog sticks, so it's cool we got dual sticks on the PS Vita. On top of that, we got a touchscreen and a touchpad on it, so there is some stuff that devs could really play around with when it comes to the PS Vita, and the PS Vita was absolutely an awesome system. I don't know why I got it so late in the PS Vita life cycle. I did get it pretty late, but I was a pretty big fan of the PS Vita. I loved everything about the PS Vita. I loved, again, the PS Vita was pretty much a PS3 in your pocket, and the graphics were phenomenal for the time for the PS Vita. Everything about the PS Vita was great. I love the fact that there was actually some very good games on the system, and I also love how much Sony was actually supporting the PS Vita. I remember right out the gate, we got things like big AAA first-party titles for the Vita, like Uncharted. Uncharted actually came out. Was it the same experience you'd be getting on like a PS3? Of course not. It wasn't going to hold up to the PS3 titles, but that's not really to be expected since we're talking about less power in your pocket. But it was still mind-blowing for the time that we can take these big AAA experiences from Sony, like Uncharted, on the go with you. That was mind-blowing. And then we also did get Killzone. Killzone was a big deal on the PS Vita, just the fact that it wasn't like your mobile shooter, kind of like any of the modern combat games from GameSoft. It was actually a very competent game on the PS Vita, and it was cool that we actually got a game that actually felt like a console shooter on the go. How mind-blowing was that? And then we even got one of the best games of all time, arguably, when it comes to RPGs. We got Persona 4, and they actually gave us a Persona 4 Golden, which I think gave the game a little bit more content. They polished the game up and things like that, and that was mind-blowing that we got a full big RPG from Atlas like that on the PlayStation Vita, and those were some of the best times. I remember getting Persona 4 Golden on the PS Vita, and I played the heck out of that, and that game was flat out amazing just to take this game on the go. So you can see that there are some very amazing experiences when it comes to the PS Vita. It just kind of sucks that Sony really dropped the ball on the PlayStation Vita. It's kind of their fault. Would it still have beaten the 3DS, or would it have made a much greater impact than the 3DS? Honestly, I don't think, no matter what Sony would have done, I don't think the PS Vita would have done as well as the 3DS and been as mainstream as the 3DS, because when it comes to handhelds, we all know the king is Nintendo, and when Nintendo really makes their consoles, they really know what they're doing, especially when it comes to supporting them, and when it comes to first-party IPs. Nintendo has all the first-party IPs covered. They have Mario, they have Fire Emblem, they have Donkey Kong, they have Kirby, they have Pokemon, again, Mario Kart. They just have so many good first-party IPs. It's really hard to really go against Nintendo when it comes to making your platform. And of course, some of the first-party IPs that Sony have probably still won't hold a candle to the mainstream audience compared to Nintendo. So of course, the PS Vita would never sell as well as the 3DS, no matter how you look at it. And the 3DS had so many good titles and so much support from Nintendo. I can see why it beat the PS Vita, but it's kind of going back to Sony's fault. It's kind of Sony's fault that the PS Vita did so well, because I remember about 3-4 years into the PS Vita's life cycle, it was pretty short in the PS Vita's life cycle, but I remember when Sony officially stopped supporting the PS Vita. What I mean by that is they didn't actually give it any first-party titles from any of their major studios. They pretty much quit supporting the PS Vita. And then what was the PS Vita left to do? It was pretty much up to the third-party developers and also the indie developers. I remember at one point it got so dry on the PS Vita, a lot of people were just kept on smashing the PS Vita and saying, look, this is pretty much an indie box at this point, and I can't agree. It pretty much turned into the ultimate indie box. So if you're a fan of these smaller indie games, kind of like what we have today with other platforms, and that's pretty much the platform that you're going to want to go to, just because it had so many indie titles coming out for it. It does kind of suck that Sony dropped the ball on it. They stopped supporting it. They stopped making games for it, first-party games anyway. And then when it comes to third-party developers, I guess third-party developers really dropped the ball on that altogether. I do know for a fact, or even though the PS Vita is pretty much dead officially at this point, I do know in Japan as of right now, people are still buying the PS Vita. It's actually outselling the Xbox, but that's not really something to really brag about just because, well, the Xbox in Japan really doesn't do well. Anyway, I just really wanted to talk about my experience with the PS Vita. It does suck that Sony pretty much abandoned the handheld market. Now, what do we have going on into the future of Sony and Sony handhelds? Will Sony ever continue on the handheld market? It is possible. Never say never. But honestly, if you ask me personally, I don't think Sony has any plans of going into the handheld market ever again. I think their first two tries with the PSP and the PS Vita, are pretty much it for Sony. I don't think Sony would ever want to do it. And I honestly think if Sony was ever to go back to the handheld market, I think Sony would want to do something like the Nintendo Switch. I think they would want to make a hybrid system because it would make sense. A lot of people are into that. And of course, Sony does have the home market pretty much covered. The PS4, I think right now is around 80 million units sold, so you can see there's a lot of PlayStation 4s out there in the wild, so it would make sense they want to combine their handheld and their home market if they ever were going to do another handheld type device from Sony. But it's interesting that the Sony PlayStation Vita is officially dead, and it sucks. A lot of gamers really didn't attached to that thing. One thing that made that thing mind-blowing, which I forgot to mention really quickly, was the fact that that was also revolutionary because the PS Vita was actually the first console to actually have dedicated internet on it. You can actually connect to your 3G connection. I think it only supported 3G connection, but if you were out and about with this, if you had a cell phone plan you paid for, you can actually get internet anywhere you were with the PS Vita, and that's something I thought was very innovative at the time, and that was pretty cool. But yeah, it's officially known. It's officially now that Sony is officially canceling the PS Vita. They're going to stop producing units and stop selling game cartridges for the PS Vita. Anyway, guys, this is Wayne from My Tech News, signing out.